The weight of legacy, when inheritance turned into a test of blood. There are moments in life when you believe something is unshakable. For me, that thing was family. Not money. Not property. Not even the idea of inheritance itself. Family. I grew up believing that no matter what happened, blood meant loyalty. That disagreements might flare up, arguments might happen, but when it truly mattered, when something big, irreversible, and emotional was on the table, we would stand together. That illusion lasted until my father died. Dad wasn't just the backbone of our family, he was the glue holding very different personalities together. He was the kind of man who believed that if you worked hard, played fair, and loved your children equally, everything else would fall into place. He didn't talk much about money, but he talked a lot about responsibility. About legacy. About not letting greed rot what generations had built. So when he got sick, and the conversations about his will began, none of us expected drama. At least, not openly. #### the early conversations. Hope disguised as unity. I remember sitting around the dining table, the same one we had used for birthdays, holidays, and late-night arguments that always ended in laughter. Dad was still alive then, weaker but lucid, determined to make things clear while he still could. He told us his will would be fair. Equal. That word mattered to him. An equal split between siblings, with some conditions tied to family businesses and properties that had been passed down long before we were born. Nothing outrageous. Nothing secretive. Just structure, so no one could sell everything off impulsively or destroy what others depended on. At the time, we all nodded. We talked about honoring Dad's wishes. About keeping things in the family. About working together. I believed every word. Looking back now, that was the first mistake. Because while those conversations sounded calm, respectful, even loving, something else was happening beneath the surface. Something quiet. Something patient. #### subtle shifts you don't notice until it's too late. The first changes were small enough to dismiss. A sibling asking more questions than usual about paperwork. Another suddenly remembering details about finances Dad had supposedly mentioned years ago. Comments framed as jokes, asterisk. Well, some of us did more for Dad than others. Asterisk. At the time, I chalked it up to stress. Grief does strange things to people, I told myself. Anticipatory grief makes people anxious. No one is thinking clearly when death looms. What I didn't realize was that grief doesn't create greed. It reveals it. The clause that changed everything. After Dad passed, the will was read. On paper, it looked exactly as promised, an equal division of assets, businesses, and properties. But then came the clause. A clause none of us had fully understood before. Certain assets were to be managed temporarily by one sibling. For logistical simplicity. Until the legal process finalized transfers. Bank access, document handling, coordination with lawyers. It sounded reasonable. Even helpful. And because this sibling had always been the responsible one, no one objected. No one questioned it. Not me. Not the lawyers. Not the rest of the family. That trust, blind, automatic, unquestioned, would cost us everything. The first hint something was wrong. It started with delays. Paperwork taking longer than expected. Accounts needing clarification. Lawyers waiting on documents that were supposedly already sent. Each delay had an explanation. Each explanation sounded plausible. Each time, we were told, asterisk. It's normal. These things take time. Asterisk. Then came the whispers. A cousin mentioning something strange they'd heard. A banker acting oddly cautious during a routine inquiry. A document that didn't align with another. Nothing concrete. Just enough inconsistency to make my stomach tighten. I remember thinking, why does this feel managed? #### trust is quiet when it breaks. Here's the thing about betrayal. It doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't kick the door in and announce itself. It waits until you're tired. Until you've assumed good intentions for too long. Until doubting someone feels worse than believing a lie. I wanted to trust my sibling. I needed to. Because the alternative meant accepting that someone who shared my childhood, my memories, my grief, was capable of stealing from their own family. At that point, I still didn't know how bad it was. I still believed this was a misunderstanding. I was wrong. Because while we were mourning our father, someone else had already started rewriting the story of his legacy, quietly, methodically, and without remorse. And the truth was buried so deep that when it finally surfaced, it would tear our family apart in ways no amount of money ever could. Unraveling the deception, when doubt turned into proof. There's a specific moment when suspicion stops being a feeling and becomes a weight. You don't know exactly what you're holding yet, only that once you pick it up, you won't be able to put it down again. For me, that moment came quietly. No confrontation. No argument. No dramatic discovery. Just a single document that didn't make sense. ##### the document that shouldn't have existed. It was an old bank statement. Not one we were expecting. Not one that had been mentioned in the will. Not one that appeared anywhere in the official list of assets. It came to me by accident, forwarded by a lawyer who assumed I already knew about it. A harmless mistake, he later said. Just routine correspondence. Except it wasn't routine. The account wasn't in Dad's name. It was in the name of a trust. A trust none of us had ever heard of. ######. The first reaction, denial. My first thought wasn't anger. It was denial. There must be an explanation. Maybe Dad set something up years ago and forgot to tell us. Maybe this was temporary. Maybe it had already been accounted for. I wanted there to be an innocent reason, because the alternative was too heavy to carry. So I asked? Carefully. Casually. Without accusation. I reached out to the sibling who had been handling the logistics. Hey, quick question. I came across a reference to a trust account. Do you know what that's about? The reply didn't come right away. When it did, it was vague. Oh yeah, that. It's nothing major. Dad set it up ages ago. The lawyers are handling it. Nothing major. That phrase echoed in my head. Because the numbers I had seen told a very different story. #####, following the paper trail. Once doubt takes hold, it changes how you see everything. I stopped asking questions out loud. I started gathering information quietly. Old emails. Archived documents. Financial statements buried in years of records. Piece by piece, a picture began to form, and it was uglier than I could have imagined. The trust hadn't just been created quietly. It had been funded repeatedly. Over years. Small amounts at first. Then larger. Then substantial. Always during periods when Dad's health declined. Always when someone else had access to his finances. Always without transparency. This wasn't an oversight. It was a system. The pattern of manipulation. What made it worse wasn't just the money. It was the pattern. Documents were altered slightly. Signatures appeared on dates Dad was hospitalized. Transactions occurred when he was heavily medicated. Nothing blatantly illegal at first glance, but enough irregularities to raise serious questions. And always, the same sibling's name appeared somewhere in the margins. As trustee. As authorized contact. As temporary administrator. Each time justified. Each time explained away. Until the explanation stopped making sense. The moment suspicion became certainty. The breaking point came when I requested a full accounting of the trust. Not aggressively. Not emotionally. Formally. Through legal channels. The response was immediate and hostile. Suddenly, I was being accused of stirring conflict. Of being ungrateful. Of trying to tear the family apart over money. That reaction told me everything I needed to know. Innocent people don't panic when asked for transparency. They comply. Confrontation without truth. We finally sat down as a family. The room was heavy with tension. Grief still hung in the air, now mixed with something darker. I laid out the documents. The timelines. The discrepancies. No raised voices. No insults. Just facts. The response? Denial. Deflection. Gaslighting. You're misinterpreting it. You don't understand how trusts work. You're letting paranoia get the best of you. At one point, they looked me straight in the eye and said, "Dad would be ashamed of you for questioning this." That sentence hurt more than any number on a bank statement. Because it weaponized his memory. The mask slips. But lies have a lifespan. The more questions were asked, the harder it became to keep stories aligned. Dates contradicted each other. Excuses shifted. Voices rose. And then, finally, anger surfaced. Not defensive anger. Entitled anger. How dare you? I did what I had to do. I deserved more after everything I sacrificed. There it was. The truth, not in words but in tone. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't confusion. This was justification. #### the emotional fallout. That night, I went home numb. Not devastated. Not furious. Just hollow. Because betrayal by family doesn't feel like being stabbed. It feels like discovering your memories were built on unstable ground. Every shared holiday. Every smile. Every, "We're in this together." All of it recontextualized. I realized something terrifying. The money wasn't the worst loss. Trust was. And trust, once broken this way, doesn't heal cleanly. #### when greed exposes character. As the investigation continued, more details emerged. Attempts to hide transactions. Pressure placed on lawyers. Subtle intimidation of anyone asking questions. It wasn't desperation. It was arrogance. The belief that no one would challenge them. That family loyalty would silence dissent. That grief would cloud judgment. They underestimated one thing. I wasn't fighting for money. I was fighting for truth. And once truth enters the room, it doesn't leave quietly. The calm before the explosion. By the time the lawyers confirmed what we feared, that a significant portion of the inheritance had been diverted illegally, the damage was already irreversible. Family members took sides. Old resentments resurfaced. Conversations became calculated. The house that once felt warm now felt hostile. And looming over everything was the question no one wanted to ask out loud. What happens next? Because uncovering betrayal is only the beginning. What follows is far worse. It's accountability. The sibling showdown, when the truth destroyed what was left. There's a moment in every family crisis when silence becomes impossible. When pretending, avoiding, and delaying no longer work, because the truth has grown too large to contain. For us, that moment arrived disguised as a family meeting. The meeting that changed everything. It was supposed to be practical. That's how it was framed. Let's all sit down. Let's clear things up. Let's handle this like adults. Those words should have reassured me. Instead, they made my stomach tighten. Because I already knew something crucial. People who benefit from lies don't want resolution. They want control of the narrative. The meeting took place in the old family house, the same place where birthdays were celebrated, arguments were smoothed over, and Dad once promised we'd always look out for one another. Now it felt like neutral ground that had chosen a side. Laying everything on the table. I didn't come armed with emotions. I came armed with facts. Printed documents. Bank records. Legal timelines. Independent assessments from 2 separate attorneys. I laid them out slowly. Carefully. No accusations. No raised voice. Just evidence. At first, there was silence. The kind that presses on your ears. Then came the denial. That can't be right. You're misunderstanding. This is being blown out of proportion. But denial only works until details appear. And the details were relentless. Dates. Amounts. Signatures. Each one chipped away at the story they'd been telling themselves, and everyone else. When denial turns into attack. Once denial collapsed, the tone changed. Suddenly, I wasn't uncovering the truth. I was attacking the family. I was accused of being greedy, being paranoid, disrespecting Dad's memory, letting lawyers poison my mind. At one point, my siblings slammed their hand on the table and said, "If you push this, you'll destroy this family forever." That's when I realized something chilling. They weren't afraid of what they'd done. They were afraid of consequences. The confession that wasn't a confession. Eventually, the language shifted. No longer, "This didn't happen." Now it was, "I did what I thought was best. I took on more responsibility. I deserved compensation." They didn't admit theft. They reframed it as entitlement. Years of sacrifice. Years of stress. Years of being the responsible one. In their mind, the inheritance wasn't stolen. It was earned. And anyone who challenged that belief was the enemy. The moment the family split. That was the exact point where the family fractured. Not dramatically. Not with shouting or tears. But with something colder. Alignment. Some relatives avoided eye contact. Some nodded quietly. Some stayed silent out of fear. And a few, very few, spoke up. "I didn't know. This doesn't feel right. We need to listen." Those voices mattered more than they'll ever know. Because betrayal thrives in silence. Legal fallout, when love meets the law. The weeks that followed were brutal. Lawyers replaced family conversations. Emails replaced phone calls. Documents replaced memories. The trust was formally challenged. Assets were frozen. An independent forensic audit was launched. Suddenly, the sibling who had acted untouchable wasn't so confident. Their tone softened. Then sharpened. Then turned desperate. Threats followed. "If you don't drop this, you'll regret this. No one will forgive you." I didn't respond. Not once. Because at this stage, words were irrelevant. The truth was already moving, slowly, methodically, and without mercy. The emotional cost no one prepares you for. People think legal battles are about winning. They're not. They're about endurance. About watching relationships rot under fluorescent lights. About hearing your family's worst instincts articulated by professionals. About realizing money can strip people of dignity faster than grief ever could. I mourned twice during that time. Once for my father. Once for the family I thought I had. The verdict that didn't fix everything. When the findings came back, they were clear. Funds had been diverted. Authority had been abused. Consent had been compromised. The trust was partially dismantled. Assets were reallocated. Legal consequences followed. Justice, technically, was served. But justice doesn't restore trust. It doesn't rewind time. It doesn't erase words spoken in anger. It doesn't mend relationships severed by greed. What it does is draw a line. And that line changes everything. Aftermath, living with the fallout. Some family members cut contact entirely. Others reached out awkwardly, unsure how to bridge the gap. A few pretended nothing had happened. The sibling at the center of it all? They disappeared. Not physically, but emotionally. No apologies. No accountability. No remorse. Just distance. And perhaps, for the first time, consequences they couldn't escape. What I learned about betrayal. Here's the truth no one likes to admit. Betrayal rarely comes from hatred. It comes from entitlement. From believing you deserve more. From convincing yourself that rules don't apply to you. From assuming others won't notice, or won't fight back. And when that illusion breaks, people don't always reflect. They retreat. Moving forward scarred, but clear. I didn't emerge victorious. I emerged changed. More cautious. More discerning. Less willing to confuse shared blood with shared values. But also stronger. Because I learned that standing up for the truth, even when it costs you comfort, relationships, and peace, is sometimes the only way to keep your integrity intact. Why I'm telling this story? If you're reading this and sensing something familiar, listen to that instinct. Ask questions. Document everything. Don't let guilt silence you. And remember, protecting yourself is not betrayal. Demanding transparency is not greed. Refusing to be gaslit is not cruelty. Sometimes the inheritance you're really fighting for isn't money. It's your sense of reality. Final words. My family's inheritance was divided by betrayal. But what truly broke us wasn't the money. It was the moment one of us decided that love, trust, and history were negotiable, and assumed no one would notice. They were wrong. And that truth, once revealed, can never be buried again. And the people who take what isn't theirs rarely accept that quietly. The aftermath, what remains when the money is gone. People think the story ends when the legal battle ends. It doesn't. That's just when the noise stops. And the silence begins. When everything slows down. After the lawyers finished. After the documents were signed. After the last court date passed. Life didn't return to normal. It became quieter. Not peaceful, quieter. There were no more urgent emails. No more deadlines. No more strategy calls. And suddenly I was left alone with the reality of what had happened. The inheritance was settled. The money redistributed. The betrayal confirmed. But the emotional debris was everywhere. The strange grief no one talks about. I expected to grieve my father. I had already done that. What I didn't expect was grieving the version of my family that never truly existed. I realized that many of the good memories were built on assumptions. That we were united. That loyalty was mutual. That shared history meant shared values. Losing that illusion hurt more than losing money ever could. Because illusions are comforting. Truth is colder. Family gatherings that never happened again. Holidays became complicated. Invitations stopped coming. Group chats went silent. Birthdays passed without messages. No one officially cut ties. They just stepped back. Conflict has gravity. People orbit away from it to avoid choosing sides. And I became a reminder. Not of greed. Not of conflict. But of truth, and truth makes people uncomfortable. The sibling who betrayed us. I heard things indirectly. That they were angry. That they felt wrong. That they believed they were the real victim. They told others I had gone too far. That I had ruined the family for money. They never mentioned the trust. The documents. The evidence. Just the outcome. That's how people preserve their self-image. By editing the story. When accountability never comes. For a long time, I waited for something. An apology. A conversation. An acknowledgement. It never came. And one day, I understood why. Admitting wrongdoing would require them to accept that they weren't who they believed themselves to be. And some people would rather lose everything than face that truth. Rebuilding without them. Slowly, I started rebuilding. Not relationships, myself. I stopped explaining. Stopped justifying. Stopped defending my decision. Anyone who needed an explanation wasn't really listening anyway. I learned to sit with the discomfort of being misunderstood. Because clarity is worth that cost. What strength actually looks like. Strength didn't look like confrontation. Or revenge. Or public exposure. It looked like choosing peace over being right. Letting go of people who only loved me when I was compliant. Accepting that some bridges collapse for a reason. It looked like boundaries that didn't require permission. The inheritance that really mattered. Here's the irony. The money changed my circumstances. But the betrayal changed my character. It forced me to learn discernment. To recognize manipulation. To trust evidence over emotion. It taught me that love without honesty isn't love, it's convenience. If you're facing something similar. If your family situation feels wrong. If things don't add up. If you're being told you're overreacting for asking reasonable questions. Listen to that instinct. Because families can lie. Blood can manipulate. And silence often protects the wrong person. Final reflection. I didn't destroy my family. I exposed the truth they were willing to sacrifice me to hide. And while the cost was high, the alternative, living in denial, would have cost me myself. Some inherit money. Some inherit responsibility. Some inherit betrayal. I inherited clarity. And that, finally, was enough. The reckoning that never came, and the freedom that did. For a long time after everything ended, I kept expecting a final moment. Some kind of reckoning. A realization. A late-night message that started with, "I've been thinking," and ended with accountability. It never arrived. And eventually I understood something important. Closure is not something other people give you. It's something you take, when you stop waiting. The myth of, "Someday they'll understand." I replayed the story in my head countless times. If I'd said it differently? If I'd waited longer? If I'd confronted them earlier? Maybe then they would have seen the truth. But that belief rested on a dangerous assumption. That understanding was their goal. It wasn't. Their goal was comfort. Control. Continuity. Truth was a threat to all three. How families rewrite history. Over time, I noticed something unsettling. My role in the family story began to change, in their version. I wasn't the one who uncovered deception. I was the one who caused trouble. I wasn't protecting what was rightfully ours. I was obsessed with money. They stopped mentioning why the legal battle happened. They only talked about what it cost them emotionally. This wasn't denial. It was narrative self-defense. And once I saw that, I stopped trying to correct it. The quiet power of letting go. There's a strange strength in not responding. Not because you're afraid, but because you no longer need validation. I didn't counter their stories. Didn't argue with relatives who half believed them. Didn't try to clear my name. I let people believe what they needed to believe. And something unexpected happened. The weight lifted. When you stop playing the role assigned to you. My entire life, I had been cast in a role. The reasonable one. The mediator. The one who keeps the peace. Exposing the inheritance betrayal shattered that identity. And for the first time, I asked myself a question I'd never asked before. Who am I when I'm not managing other people's comfort? The answer didn't come immediately. But it came quietly, in choices. Building a life that doesn't need their approval. I made decisions without running them past anyone. I stopped filtering my thoughts. Stopped minimizing my success. I surrounded myself with people who didn't flinch when things got uncomfortable. People who valued honesty over harmony. Not many. But enough. The unexpected gift of being the villain. Once I accepted that I would always be the villain in someone else's story, something shifted. Villains don't need to perform. Villains don't need permission. Villains are free from the burden of pleasing everyone. And in that freedom, I finally felt peace. What I'd tell my past self. If I could go back and speak to the person I was before all of this, I'd say, "You're not imagining it. You're not greedy for wanting fairness. You're not cruel for refusing to stay silent. And most importantly, you don't lose your family when you speak the truth. You learn who never truly stood with you." The final truth about betrayal. Betrayal isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like paperwork. Sometimes it looks like omissions. Sometimes it looks like smiles that hide strategy. And sometimes, the most shocking betrayal isn't what they took. It's how easily they justified taking it. Why I'm finally at peace. I didn't get an apology. I didn't get reconciliation. I didn't get a repaired family. But I got something far more valuable. Clarity without doubt. Boundaries without guilt. Self-respect without negotiation. And I learned a lesson I will carry for the rest of my life. Money reveals character. Conflict reveals loyalty. And silence reveals priorities. Final words. If telling the truth costs you relationships, those relationships were already costing you yourself. I didn't win the inheritance. I reclaimed my agency. And that was the real legacy my father left behind. Even if it took losing almost everything to understand it. This is where my story ends. Not with forgiveness. Not with revenge. But with freedom.